I brought this little bear up with me because the truth is, about a decade ago, I probably would have been embarrassed even to be holding on to a bear like this because somebody would have perceived me as a lesbian. So sometimes people look at me and they think, oh, she woke up as this wonderful, compassionate human being one day. So not true. So the reason I've got my computer and not my typed notes that I came down here with is I got up this morning at 5 o'clock to do a standard phone call that I have every week, and the message sort of changed because what I started to realize is it's not just you people that I want to talk to, it's the church at large. Because this message will be multiplied 100, 1,000 times. And so the message is for the church at large, because I could encourage you, and I would love to encourage you, but there's a bigger message here. And so what I'm going to talk to you about is my testimony, because it's pretty powerful of how I got to be an ally to the LGBT community, and why I think I was kind of built for it, and then the work that I do. And then I want to look at briefly the history of homosexuality in history, and what it says in the Bible or doesn't say in the Bible, and then what marriage is in the Bible, and what we perceive it to be, and what marriage is in history, and then how we blend all those things together. And then, in the culture that we're in, how do we then engage the church? How do we look like Christians, like gay Christians and allies, and engage the church? Because the church is doing a dreadful job of it. We know that. Jesus needs a new PR program, and I think the gay Christian community is that PR program. So, and I am not shining you on with that one at all, because I spend a lot of time in churches and I see more grace and mercy and forgiveness and the fruits of the Spirit in the gay Christian community than I do in the church at large. So the church needs you. Well, I guess I could sit down because that would be the end. The church needs you. Don't go anywhere. But so honestly, I would have been very embarrassed that somebody would have perceived me as a lesbian. So I'm straight. I'm a mother of two. I have two children, 25 and 27. Both of my children are straight. People ask that all the time. So I have no dog in this fight. I'm just in it because of the compassion and call on my life from my Savior. I mean, right? So there you go. I was raised in New York City. I was raised, and that's probably part of why I can fight back. I've got that chip on my shoulder, chip in my heart, chip under my skin. We're just kind of people that just say, no. So I've got that in me. It's got to be tamed all the time, all the time. So I'm learning how to do that. But I was raised by a single mother. And my dad left when I was 2. And I experienced discrimination in the Catholic Church because I was raised in the late 50s. I was born in 56, raised in the late 50s, early 60s in an Irish Catholic community in New York. And when I went to the Catholic school that I went to, I was the only child from a family that was divorced in the Catholic school I went to. About 40% of the kids I went to school with still had brogues, first-generation Americans. Very strong sense of marriage in the Irish Catholic community in New York. So that when my father committed adultery and left my mother, she was the scarlet A on her, and she was abandoned by the Catholic Church. And so I had no language to discuss that. There was so much shame within divorce. It sounds crazy, but there was so much shame within divorce in a Catholic family at the time that I was outcast. I spent a lot of time hiding. I never even said to my best friends that I didn't have a father. How did I ever accomplish it, right? But I would say he worked late at night, he traveled a lot. Like, I even understood any of that. I didn't understand any of it. But what I did see as a child was the way my mother was treated. And I knew my mother to be nothing but love. So when I saw that the way the church treated her, I guess that planted a seed in me. I've been writing a book lately, and it's been making me go back and say, why God did my trajectory lead here? And I see that that's part of it, is that I had a heart for fairness and justice as a child because I saw the way my mother was treated. I'm going to fast forward so that my Roman Catholic friends don't be offended by my stance on Catholicism. My mother's a Catholic. My mother only came back to God, if she ever was there in the first place, at the age of 74. And the way she did was, just through example of my own life, she was going through a moving from the East Coast to Arizona, and I went back east to help her for 8 days, and at the end of that, I hadn't gotten frustrated at her or cursed at her or dropped anything or broken anything, and I cleared a 2-story house out with 74 years of stuff. My stepfather, who had died, was a pack rat, and in 8 days, I cleared out that house of good temper. So my mother at the end of it looked and said, okay, there's something in her. She's been talking about it for years, but I actually see it now. So my mother came back to the Lord at her age of 74, and a few years ago, I arranged in Reno, where I live, for a Catholic priest to apologize to my mother in the name of the church. And so I arranged this, and I brought her into town, and I wanted someone to apologize, because I do a straight apology. I go around from pride event to pride event, and I apologize to people for what the church has done to people. So I realize the value of apology. So I arranged for a Catholic priest in town to sit down with my mother in an office and have my mother tell the story. And the two of them end up, well, me too, crying and apologizing to my mother for what the church had done to her 50 years ago in abandoning her and casting her out. So that's coming. But this is part of my background. So I was married at 27. The first 7 years were fabulous, sort of. they're good. And about year 7, there were some issues. And because I'm a high achiever by nature, I couldn't understand why my marriage was falling apart. And I actually realized 1 year into marriage that it was falling apart, and I was not a Christian. Although I was raised a Catholic, I never made a commitment, and I finally made a commitment when I was 27, 26, 20, well, when I was 27, I made a commitment because my marriage was falling apart. And I thought the last thing I wanted to have break apart was the thing I wanted most, was a marriage. So I thought, well, God, if you know me better than I do, I'm not sure you do, but if you know me better than I do, maybe you can help me figure this out. So I was married for 20 years. 7 years into that marriage, it was difficult already. I raised 2 children, and at year 19, my husband decided he didn't want to be married anymore. So that does a few things to a devout believer who leads Bible studies. I homeschooled my children for 6 years. I mean, I've got tons of evangelical cred, right? Tons of cred on the street in the evangelical community. Did all the Bible studies, all the Kay Arthur, Beth Moore Bible studies, went to them, led them, did the junior high Bible studies. But I was in this kind of thinking that if I did A and B and C, then D would show up. I was just pretty regimented in my thinking. I went to engineering school. I excelled at that. You know, it was always like, do this, do this, do this, and then this shows up. So when my marriage didn't pan out, it's not that it was a crisis of faith. It was a crisis of Kathy knowing everything. And that was important to happen for me. Because I was saying to you a little while ago that we crossed paths. Linda and I crossed paths, and we didn't cross paths. We were in the same town in 1990, and she said, "This is too bad that I didn't run into you then." I said, no, it's good for you that you didn't run into me, because I would have told you what you needed to do, and I know I was right. And I could have laid it out for you and invited you to a Bible study, and you know, within, I would have assumed 2 lunches, you probably would have committed, been committed. I should have been committed, but you would have committed. I mean, that's the expectations I had. So I was in a difficult spot of my own life not working out. And because what I do when I'm happy, when I'm sad, when I need to think, when I need to do anything, I hit trails. That's why the ministry is called Canyon Walker Connections. I walk in canyons every day. I live in the Sierra, and I was up on the trails hiking, and I kept running into the same woman all the time, and I thought one day that I think I'll walk with this person. So I got back to the bottom of the trailhead, and she was just starting up, and I actually said to her, "Do you mind if I turn around now and walk with you for a while?" And I ended up walking with Neto. She's a big part of my story. I didn't have any gay friends that I knew of before that. And I figured out when I got back to her truck and I saw, you know, a rainbow thing on her truck. And I remember looking and thinking, oh my God, what if she's a lesbian? Then I'm going to have to show up, right? I'm going to have to do this thing. I have a gift of evangelism, well, surprise, right? Easy talker, good salesperson, ... gift of evangelism. And so I thought I would have to, in my old life, I would have convinced her. I would have thought I had to do something. But I was in a place of doubt already. This is very important for my story, is that I didn't know all the answers. So I was finally in a place, the girl that knows everything suddenly didn't know everything. So I was able to let Neto be Neto and me not be me. Thank you, God, be somebody else. And so we hiked together, and I had been for years every Friday morning in a group of women. We just had breakfast together every Friday morning. And I was telling them, I think the woman I'm hiking with, no, I'm pretty sure, actually, she's a lesbian. I mean, she never says husband. She never says children. She's got these rainbow colors in her truck with her kayaks on top, But then I make fun of that, but I drive a Subaru with roof racks that in the summer, my kayaks are always on top, right? So, I could be judging myself, and I have equality stickers on the back, right? So I'm classic. So I kept telling them, and they said, well, when are you going to tell her about Jesus? When are you going to tell her? And there was nothing in me that could. Because what am I supposed to say? If you leave your lifestyle and come and join my team, look how wonderful your life can be. I was hiking on those trails every day, sobbing. I used to put, there was a crook in a tree that every time, it didn't matter if it was, there's a lot of snow where I live, but I had a crook in a tree that I decided every day that I was going to make my life an altar to God. So I would take a rock from somewhere that I saw on the trail that wasn't covered with snow, and I would carry it up to this, or snowshoe up to this point where this tree was, and every day I would put a rock on there and say, I'm making a conscious decision, God, to follow you, because this is just too hard. So how am I supposed to take that kind of peace, joy, and righteousness and export it to a lesbian? It just didn't work in my head. So for the next 5 years, well, within a year, Neto came out to me. But by the time she came out to me, I already loved her. So it didn't matter. And I remember just putting my hand around her waist and saying, as she said to me, Kathy, I've got to tell you this, I'm a lesbian. And I said, is like that all you got? Because she said, I'm really afraid to talk to you about this. I'm like, okay, can we just go for this hike? And so then she started bringing me into her social circles. So did Kathy the next day then wake up as an advocate? Absolutely not. That was 2001. For the next 5 years, I hiked with Neto, and she started bringing me into her social environments. So I was hanging around with a lot of lesbians, almost every lesbian party I had ever gone to. Like, there's a difference between lesbian party and straight girl parties. Well, actually, there are. There isn't. Actually, if you've ever been to a lesbian gift exchange at Christmas, they look totally different than the church girl gift exchanges at Christmas. Those girls fight over the flashlight sets and the socket sets, and this, and I'm like, somebody knew that I was going to be there, so they brought a cupcake carrier because they knew that I was going to be there. So when somebody opened up that should have had the socket set, the cupcake carrier, I was like, that is mine. And the other one said, Kathy, we all know it's yours. You're going to end up with it. Calm down. But in the straight girl parties, it's like lotions and note papers with irises on it. So the parties really are different. But so I was hanging around in the parties for 5 years. Never met a gay Christian. Not once. So my paradigm of gay and Christian was fine. I wasn't struggling with it at all, because nobody confronted it. Nobody came to me and said, what do you do with gay and Christian? I was just kind of floating in this world, not ignoring what my faith said, but not knowing what to do with what my faith said. Comfortable non-confrontation. But then, so that was 5 years of that. But in 2004, I specifically remember watching the election returns. And there were either 18 or 19 states that year that had some kind of form of marriage on the ballot. And every one of them, it depends on what the ballot said, but every one of them voted against same-sex marriage, civil unions, or for discrimination of use. Every one of them fell that way. And I was dating a man at the time, and I was watching the election returns with him, and when the election returns came in, he said, "Oh, good, I'm so glad that, they lost all of them." And it was the first time. That was 2004, and I had met gay people in 2001. So I'm just trying to tell you how slow we go. I mean, we got all the power, but we don't have all the brains. So in 2004, I remember when he said that, being so mad that he said that I got up and he was doing dishes in the kitchen like a good man should. I was at his house and I didn't have television, so he was doing the dishes. And so, and I remember walking straight up to him. This man's a pretty powerful man in real life, really powerful man. And I walked up to him toe to toe and I said, "You tell me," and I said, he said, "It's a good thing that happened because they're destroying America." So, Kathy, that knows nothing about what the Bible says about it, but I know what justice looks like. Justice, I understand. So I said, "Who's destroying America?" And he said, "The gay people. They're destroying America, they're destroying families, they're destroying marriage." So, because it's taped, I won't tell you some of the personal exchanges there. Not inappropriate, but challenging him on his own former marriage and how that fell apart. And I was so angry. And it was the first time I remember feeling a sense of injustice about the LGBT community. It's the first time ever during the elections. And I felt like somebody had punched me in the throat, and it was so painful. It was just so painful to think about this group of people being discriminated against. Never had it before. And so the next day did Kathy wake up, Miss Loving Advocate? No, certainly not. So, excuse me. So what happened was, in 2006, at the end of the year, 2006, at the end of the year, I happened to be watching something, reading the New York Times, and there was an article on the Gay Christian Network in the New York Times. And it was on the front page, and because I was reading the digital copy, I could not believe I saw the words gay and Christian together. Now, I've been hanging around, this is 2000 to 2006. Since 2001, I've been hanging out with gay people, very comfortably. And now all of a sudden I see the words gay and Christian, and I really did sit there at my computer and think, like, how is this? How is this even possible? And I'm educated, I'm social, I hang around with gay people, and I don't know that there's gay Christians. And as I said, no one had confronted me on this issue at all. So I was comfortable. And when I started clicking on the links, and it was going to the Gay Christian Network site, I thought, I'm going to find the mission statement because I know what the mission statement's going to say. I know exactly what it's going to say. And every third word would have been, and I'm, sorry to offend, but this is straight people, and you know it. Every third word would have been in the mission statement, anal sex, right? Because we're straight. And when we think of homosexual, we think of sex. And you know that. Well, that's where I was too. As educated and as relational as I was, that's where I was. Embarrassed to say, but it's the truth. So when I read this mission statement, and it was about Jesus and God and relationship and commitment, and I agreed with it, and that bothered me. So 3 weeks later, I found myself, thank you very much. Thank you, I don't care. 3 weeks later, I found myself, because I'd gone to that to the website, I had noticed that there was a conference. It was in Seattle. And I tend to be a risk taker, I guess. So things don't scare me. So when I saw that there was a conference, I thought, maybe I should go to this thing. And when I went, I called Justin Lee up. I tracked him down because, believe me, if I want you, I will hunt you down and I will find you. And this is to my detractors. Anyone that follows me knows recently I found someone that had been hunting me down for years. So I called Justin Lee up, had a 5-minute conversation, said, I'm not coming to try to change anybody, but I didn't know you guys existed. I'd love to come see gay people, gay Christians. So flew up there, didn't know anybody, had never seen a gay Christian with my own eyes, had spoken to one for 5 minutes on the phone, went to the conference. First night, worship, Thursday night. I stood specifically at the back of the room, and I observed because I thought, I wonder if this really exists. So I stood at the back of the room, and as soon as, probably 5 minutes into worship, when I saw between 300 and 400 gay Christians worshiping God, it so resonated in my spirit. There was nothing anybody could have done at that point to tell me you didn't exist. Nothing. I actually ended up at the back of the room, on the floor, crying. Because I knew that I was getting to see something that people just didn't get to see. And I wanted to remember it. And night 2 of the conference, sometimes I traffic in prophetic words. Like, they're mostly for me because I don't, because I like to talk, I like to speak, so God talks to me that way. Like, I'm a magnet for prophets. I could walk by a church and they would drag me, and the Lord says. So God understands that about me. But what happened was the final night of sharing, God had given me a prophetic word, and he let me feel in that prophetic word. It's a bigger story, but he let me feel and apologize for the first pain I felt was the pain that God felt when society in general rejected the gay community. It was pretty bad, and I apologized, and a lot of people cried. And then the next pain I felt was the pain that God feels when parents reject their children. And that was pretty bad. And then I apologized for that. And then the final pain I felt, which is the closest I've ever come to not being able to speak, which is pretty amazing. But I couldn't, how sometimes when you're trying to say something, like you're overwhelmed with joy or pain or something, and you open your mouth to say the words, and you just can't even get that first word out. That's how it felt. I couldn't even get the first word out about the pain God feels when the church rejects the gay Christians. It was so deep, and I'm not even sure I have felt anything that profoundly deep and sad since then, before then. But what God feels about what the church is doing to you, it's changed my life. And I came home 2 days later, and I ended a 5-year relationship because he wasn't on board with God's plan. So that changed my life. So that's all the background. So what do I do? Because what I really, so I interact a lot with kids. People find me. They find me on Facebook. They find me on YouTube. Kids find me on YouTube. Other people find me through my blog. But people tend to find me. And I'm good at connecting people. I'm good at taking a kid that's in a desperate situation, connecting him with an organization that at least he can find support in, with mentors in the gay Christian world that I trust, with pastors that might be affirming in his area, with churches that might be affirming in their area, with just some kind of help. So I do that a lot. I've become sort of a clearinghouse also for straight people, because about 5 years ago, I would have done big happy dances when one straight person contacted me a month and said, okay, you're not crazy. I kind of get what you're doing. And I'd like to understand what you're doing. But now it's happening all the time. All the time. And what I'm getting more of that's very pleasing is pastors. Pastors that are knowing something is wrong. Unfortunately, they're not in the conservative churches. They're not in the Southern Baptist churches. They're not in the evangelical churches. There might be Methodist pastors. I love the Methodists. Oh, gosh, I love those Methodists. But I can't be one. I have to be evangelical. God, to knock on the doors of conservative churches, you can't be like those other things like Episcopalian or Presbyterian or Methodist. You got to be evangelical. But those pastors are finding me. And recently when I drove up I took a trip to the Pacific Northwest. On the way, I met with 3 different pastors. They're not courageous enough to sometimes sit down and have these conversations within their churches, but they find me and they want to Skype with me, or they want to talk to me, or they send me lots of questions. So I've been getting to do a lot of that too. So the next 2 things, which, oh gosh, I can't believe it has to be so brief, but homosexuality and the Bible. First, homosexuality and history. Because when I talk about homosexuality in the Bible, there'll be almost nothing to say if I just say these few statements. It was only in the early 1880s that a man named, got to get the man's name right, Carl Kurt Benny. He is a bookbinder and a journalist. And he had several friends, male friends that were attracted to other male friends. We call them homosexuals, gay people. There was no language for that. So he noticed that there was this attraction for some of his male friends for other male friends. And he was in the bookbinding business and trafficked in literature and stuff. So, oh, surprise, surprise, there happened to be a lot of men there that were attracted to other men, right? Gay men liking the finer intellectual things in life. What a surprise. So what happened was one of his best friends committed suicide. And it bothered him, and he held on to that for a while. And then he wrote a pamphlet in the late 1880s, and there was no word for these men that were attracted to other men. So he coined the word homosexual. And in the 1890s, 2 medical journals picked up the word homosexual. And it wasn't until 1920 that word homosexual actually appeared in the dictionary. And it was 14 years later, this is a surprising thing, that the word heterosexual showed up. Does that tell you that there's no understanding of sexual orientation in the 20s and 30s? There was no understanding. The word homosexual showed up before the word heterosexual showed up. And when you look in the dictionary, both of those words, when they talk about whatever this thing is they're talking about, it's always talking about passion and lust. We talked about passion and lust a lot. A lot. So, and then it was in the 1950s, actually in 1948, that the very first Bible showed up with the word homosexual in it. So they had no word for this thing 30 years before. And in 1948, the New Revised Version showed up as the word homosexual. Until that point, the word had always been translated as people that traffic in this male-to-male sex trade or sexual prostitutes, but it was never talking about, committed long-term relationships. It was always talking about this passion and lust and abuse thing. And then, even in the 1968 Catholic Bible, the word that we see in our Bibles now, a lot of them, as homosexual, that word said masturbator in the Catholic Bibles. So it makes it hard on Sunday collections when you tell all the masturbators they can't come to church. Right? Maybe the priest may not even show up. So you got to do something with that word. So that word became homosexual because tiny percent of the population, minority, no one's fighting back. So, and then in 1973, now as I said, a lot of you may know this, but people watching may not know, it wasn't until 1973 that psychologists, the medical association started realizing this thing they were seeing between men. They were seeing it between women too, but it's the men that bother us because of that, that. So this thing they were seeing, for the first time in the world history, they started realizing this behavior they were seeing between men was not an extension of excess sexual behavior or sexual deviation or lust or mental illness. It was actually a long-term, persistent behavior and action in people. And they took it out of the books and they declassified it as a mental illness and they called it a sexual orientation. So that happened in 73, 40 years ago. But somehow, the conservative churches have not gotten the memo. They just haven't gotten the memo. So I'm wondering how 6 verses in a Bible written 2,000 years ago and in Leviticus 3,400 years ago, Leviticus and Deuteronomy. How did a fisherman named Paul, who wrote Romans, how did a guy like that ever figure out that there were these things called homosexuals when our society didn't even figure it out until 1973? So is it possible that Paul was writing about homosexuals? He was not. What they were writing about, all they understood about sexuality at that point was sexual desires and passions. So when they saw this behavior that they didn't understand that was associated with the Gentiles and the idol worshipers, that was all about sexual passions, excessive lusts. It had nothing to do with long-term committed relationships, nothing. So what does the Bible say about homosexuality? Nothing. It says nothing about homosexuality. What does it say about long-term committed relationships and fidelity and faithfulness within committed relationships? A lot. So when the Bible is asking me to behave a certain way, it's asking you to behave that certain way. But it's not asking any extra burdens on you because you are same-sex attracted. No extra burdens at all. So marriage. Let's talk about marriage because this is the big push point today. So marriage, what's the history of marriage? Of course, it's in the garden, right? Well, the word marriage doesn't show up. The word marriage doesn't show up until Genesis 34, 2,400 years after the garden. So I know it's an important thing, and I know it's modeled in the garden, but 8 kinds of marriage are modeled in the Old Testament and New Testament. 8 kinds of marriage. 1 happens to be modeled in Genesis 2. But God, being the God that he is and he knows he needs children, he better darn well put a heterosexual woman in there and a heterosexual man. It's because he needs to procreate. But he's got other models of marriage too. But why was that woman created? So some people will tell us that complementarianism is what all of marriage is about. Most of the anti-gay theologians today will tell you that it's all about the difference between man and woman and procreating this child. This is what marriage is. That's not the biblical definition of what marriage was. When the man was in the garden, he didn't say, oh my goodness, who am I gonna have some hot sex with? He said, I'm lonely. I'm lonely. So all the animals are paraded before him. Nothing satisfies him. So God puts him to sleep, wherever your picture of the story is, and creates woman. And he creates woman for man because he's lonely. And when he looks at her, he doesn't say, you've got part A, I've got part B, let's smash it together and make a kid. He doesn't say that. He looks at her and he says, you are bone of my bone and you are flesh of my flesh. He sees what is the same in her. He sees the similarities in her. And when you trace bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh through the Bible, it's the only place it talks about marriage. The next time it's when Jacob comes to Laban, and he comes to this tribe of Laban, And he says Laban greets him and says, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. You're my kin. You're like me. When David comes to the tribe of Israel and he wants some help, they say the same thing to him. Bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. We're like each other. And when you take it into the New Testament, when we become new creatures in Christ, we become bone of his bone and flesh of his flesh because we're like him. So what we're seeing in the garden, yes, we call it a marriage, but that first thing we're seeing is a like relationship. We are seeing a relationship that God gave people for intimacy and security and protection and for mutual love and mutual respect. And can same-sex loving people do that with one another? Absolutely. So don't get strangled by this old creation picture of what marriage is and isn't. The new modern picture, like people will say, don't you dare change the definition of marriage. Marriage is one man, one woman to make procreation. There's nowhere in that original God didn't come to Adam and say, I need you to procreate. I'm going to give you a sexual partner. This is going to be great. He says, you're lonely. I'm going to give you a partner that's going to take away that loneliness. So this new definition we see, it's a new definition. And have we been challenged by this definition in our own? So let's just go quickly through history. So quickly through history. So in the first 300 years of the church ignored marriage in terms of what we see as marriage. They would do things like they would say, I marry you, or they would get together because what they were looking at was the Roman model of marriage, and they didn't want to be anything like the civil Roman model, so they eschewed marriage. It wasn't until the 7th century they started to recognize this thing, and they started calling it a sacrament. And in the 12th century, it was on the official list of sacraments, up there with baptism. But it wasn't until 1563, Council of Trent, when they made this thing an official church document. And I've got my own ideas of why the church did that, but suddenly, this union between two people had to involve a priest, which cost money, because the priest now had to come into town and he had to check out your records to make sure you weren't marrying your cousin. And we had enough sense about that then. And so it was not only a place where we could make sure people weren't closely related, but now we were starting to care about children, that children should be brought up in the confines of this relationship. So the church started licensing marriages. And it was also in that place, just for like party fact on the side, that they also said that priests, from now on, if you were married, you couldn't do mass anymore. Because what was happening when the priests who were married, when they were dying, their holdings, their wealth, was going to the widow. And that wasn't good. It had to go back to the church. So from now on, they also decided that when the priest, if they married, they couldn't say mass. So within time, marriage for priests also died out. So a lot of stuff happened there. So until the late 1900s in our own country, or in history, there was marriages weren't really based on on love. Women weren't treated appropriately. Even Aristotle, when he wrote about a woman, side note, when Aristotle wrote about women, he thought that women were just badly deformed boys in uterus. We were just not fully developed men, in terms of intellectually, because we were weaker and all those things. So what we see then of marriage has changed in our own history. And somebody was saying to me the other day, you want to change this definition of marriage? And I said, you're the same age as me. Marriage has changed definition in my lifetime. In 1967, in I think it was 13 states, it was still illegal to marry interracial marriages. And interracial wasn't just black and white. In Oregon, they couldn't marry Native Hawaiians. Or Native Indian. Crazy, right? Native Hawaiians, why are they on the list? So, Filipinos have been on the list, of course. All Asians have been on the list. And black people, of course, they're on the list, but let's throw in Native Hawaiians. Native Americans in South Carolina, it was Native Americans. In Oregon, Washington, it was Native Americans. So we've had these prejudices. And when 1967 came along, Loving versus the state of Virginia, only 20% of the people in the United States believed a marriage between interracial marriages were appropriate. In 1958, 4% of Americans thought interracial marriages were appropriate. And you know the excuses they used? Interracial marriages, all about sex. They're all about sex. They're unnatural. It's not in the plan of God. I mean, this sounds pretty familiar, right? But we're at a point in our country where 58% of Americans know now that marriage is a civil right. So that was 20% of Americans when the interracial marriage was, when the definition of marriage was changed. So we all know it's in the courts now, but, and I hear this a lot, is marriage a civil right? Of course marriage is a civil right. Someone said to me, show it to me in the Bill of Rights. And I said, okay, first let's look at the Constitution. And then let's follow, this is why we have the Supreme Court, so they can interpret within the culture what this document means. And in 1967 and in 1974, Zablocki versus Red Hale, marriage has been, and in Loving versus the state of Virginia, marriage has been defined by the Constitution of the United States to be a civil right. So don't let anybody ever tell you that you do not have the right to be married. So now Wednesday, the Supreme Court is going to be starting to hear DOMA, Defense of Marriage Act. And I follow constitutional law because I'm that dull. So I look so interesting, but Friday nights, I mean, sometimes I'm there texting, like, did you realize what this word meant in the Bible with a friend of mine? Like, I said, is everybody as boring as we are? Apparently not. So I met the lady that's suing the United States, People versus the United States, Edie Windsor. I met her a few years ago. Little tiny lady, 83-year-old. I got to spend about an hour and 15 minutes with her at a task force meeting, met her outside of something. And at that time, and I think it was 2 years ago, Edie Windsor thought it would be 5 to 6 years before this became before the Supreme Court. And here it is. And there is no way even the most conservative of judges will not see that this needs to be struck down. It just has to be struck down. I mean, constitutional law, you follow it. So, because I've got to go faster, I want to get to the point of what the church needs to do. Oh gosh, there's so much to say. I've told people now that once God turned this button on me, and there's like hardly any way to turn it off. Okay, so the conservative church, they're the ones I deal with. The other churches are getting it. Of course, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, and yay, the Methodists. But, woohoo! And they're all getting it. But it's these conservative churches. I only know of one evangelical church run by a straight pastor in the United States that is gay affirming. That's pretty bad. I don't know of any Southern Baptist churches. And we are I'm going to say we because I stand in that tribe too, we are the dominant culture. So when we stand and we say that you're trying to define marriage and you're taking our family, you're breaking up our families, and you're destroying the institution itself, we're not being hateful. We have no clue. As I told you, in 1973, the memo came out. It went into a, outbox for the evangelical church and the Southern Baptist Church. We never got that memo. Most of us don't realize that you haven't chosen this. That's where I was in 2001. I thought people chose to be gay. I never could have imagined a gay Christian. I thought if you followed my God, I wasn't going to say it because I didn't want to be, held accountable to witness to you about it. But if you followed my God, you too could be as wonderful as I am. But you could be straight. That was 11 years ago, 12 years ago. It's what I really believed. And I think I'm typical of the middle of the church. So you think they're being mean or hateful. I am telling you that the conservative church is pretty much clueless on the issue of homosexuality. They don't understand really how the whole classification of it as a mental illness happened. They've been told it was, radical gay activists that made that happen and pressuring people, the whole paradigm. They don't understand that even that marriage is a civil right. They don't understand the dangers of even reparative therapy. They don't have a clue of what this stuff is doing to their children. This is what I do, I can tell you, they don't have the language, they don't have the understanding of this. I recently went to an ex-gay leader, came to my town, and for 4 sessions he spoke to people, and on the first night he spoke to a room of 200 12 to 18-year-olds about reparative therapy. Well, you've got to know, if you know me, you've got to know that twisted my brain around, because we've got all my hot buttons now. You just throw in transgender and you've got all my hot buttons. Because you mess with a transgender person, you get all the New York in me coming out, all of it. All of it. And so he was talking about mental illness and how dirty and disgusting the sex was. 12 to 18-year-olds for 90 minutes. And then at the end of these 4 days, there was a question and answer period. Bigger story, but they knew what I was going to stand and say. I had a 1 minute and 30-second statement to say about the dangers of reparative therapy on their children. And because they knew I was there, as soon as I stood up, I said my name, and I said the beginning of my group. I said, and I'm the executive director of Canyon, and suddenly I had 5 security guards on me, 2 plainclothes policemen, dragging me out of a megachurch in my town because I said my name. But my reputation, but they knew what I was going to say. And even reading what I was going to say, which was research on the dangers of reparative therapy on children, and I don't use inflammatory language when I write, because I know who I'm writing to, they dragged me out of there. And since then, some conversations have happened around me because they haven't apologized to me or taken any kind of responsibility for what they did. What they did in the state of Nevada was battery and assault. But they haven't taken any responsibility. But they're having conversations on the edge that I know are happening. And they have no clue about the validity of what I was saying. And we are talking about children. We're talking about precious children. And I think Stanton said to me yesterday, well, when they get that they're talking about their own kids and that the danger of this is the suicide of their own kids, well, then they'll get buy-in. No, because they don't associate it. It's like other people's kids, other weaker children. They don't understand. They just do not understand about homosexuality, reparative therapy, same-sex marriage, long-term loving, committed relationships, civil rights. I'm telling you, those conservative churches don't have a clue. So when you're saying that they're being hateful, they're not really being hateful. They're really just uneducated. So here's where you come in. It's time for you to start educating the church, because they are planting an entire theology, dogma about at least 5% of the population on 6 verses of Scripture. 6 verses out of 54,000 verses in the Bible. They're taking 6 verses and building in a theology about a group of people. Well, if you go back to what God really said in the Old Testament, if you just take the Torah, the 5 books, you've got about 5,400 verses, one-tenth. And in those 5,400 verses, 33 times God says, care for and treatment of the stranger. He must have meant it. 6 times in 54,000 verses, there's something about same-sex behavior. And in 1/10 of that, in his book to his people, 33 times he talked about the treatment of other people. So we're completely out of balance, but we know that. And what I see is there's a group of people that are influencers that don't want to lose their power. They don't want to lose their power, and they don't want to lose their control, and they don't want to be wrong. And you are threatening them, and you are scaring them. But they don't know who you are. So I can understand how they feel threatened, and they keep repeating the things, the church keeps repeating the things that those influencers way back there are telling them. I am not a fan of the Family Research Council. I am not a fan of Concerned Women for America or National Organization for Marriage or Michael Brown and his 700-page book that says yuck about you. He's a Christian that wrote a 700-page book that all the conservatives are using as the Bible against you people. I think there's 3 Bible verses in this book by a Christian that talks about you. They don't get it. So this is very, very, very scary to the church. And when I come back in May, there'll be a lot of discussion about how you engage people like that, because I can do that. I've learned, and the only reason I'm so good at it is because I've done it wrong so many times. I've gotten engaged in those conversations, and it's just like tied myself up. You know, it's just like, I always come out smarter because I'm smarter. But I don't win, and I don't shift people. And there's ways to use your energy. There's people that are called to it. There's people that better stay away from it because it's just more depressing and hurtful to you. And there's definitely conversations to have, and there's information you ought to know. So we'll talk about that in May. But what I also care about is, as you engage this conversation, because it is happening now, I will tell you what I believe about the next 2 years. It is going to be nasty, nasty, nasty. Whatever you think you've seen already, multiply it. Because as the dominant culture starts to lose their power from people they do not understand, and as the Christian heterosexual loses that power position, and where in the New Testament was, the Christian as the power? Not sure where that came from. But as these people lose their position, because they think now you're persecuting them, right? All you want is your rights, but somehow this feels as persecution because they have to share now. They feel so threatened. So engaging them, remember as you engage them to apply what God also said. God also said, treatment of the stranger. They're not your tribe either. And if he really meant treatment of the stranger, and remember, you once were strangers too. You once were strangers too. So as you come back into the church, as you're allowed back into the church to engage, remember how to appropriately engage, because you're the ones that have the responsibility, the ability, the chance to get it right. Because we've gotten it so wrong. So as you come back into the church, you are the ones that are going to teach us grace and mercy and forgiveness and compassion. And I am not walking out of the church because I want to see the church recovered. There are some people that say, like all kinds of people write to me. Atheists, agnostic, witches write to me. All kinds of people write to me. And they say, we love what we see in you because it's the Jesus we picture. This is what we picture Christianity to be. Christianity is losing its hold in this culture completely because of how the church has behaved. And we need you, just like I needed you in my life. In 2001, I'm not like the top of it, but I know compassion and I know grace. And what your community has taught me by interacting with you, I now can export to other kinds of people and strangers in my community. And I've become a better Christian because of what you've done in my life. And that's what the church needs you to do, is to come back and engage us appropriately and with lots of patience and compassion, because we're stupid. We are stupid. We do not know that there's sexual orientation. We do not know if we pressure you to change, we're going to hurt you. We do not know that this relationship you have between you is love and not lust. We don't know any of this stuff. That's so genuine. This is what I traffic in. So you need, oh gosh, you've waited a long time, but I say 2 years more. I say 2 years of nasty, nasty, nastiness. Because as you rip it out of their cold, dead hands, they are going to get nasty. So just get ready. And just know securely that God never said any of this stuff about you. Never said any of this negative stuff about you. And you're the chance the church has to learn grace, mercy, forgiveness, and compassion. So don't abandon us while we tell you how awful you are. But I will tell you, the Christian church needs the gay Christian community. No doubt about it. No doubt about it. So don't leave us. Be nice to us. But hold our feet to the fire, because the Bible says nothing about you, and you deserve all your civil rights. So when I come back in May, we can talk about how to have these conversations, because what I do is I go from pride event to pride event, and I wear a shirt that says, "Hurt by church, get a straight apology." And it is stunning. You've been with me. It's stunning to watch how people react when a Christian does the right thing and appropriately does what was done to my mom and apologizes and takes responsibility for something that never was intended. So there you go. So I'll be back in May and we can talk about how to do that. And I'm going to help you with Long Beach Pride here. And we're just going to, oh gosh, there's so much pressure on you. You got to love the straight church. You got to love the gay community that doesn't think that God loves them anymore. A lot of work for you people, so. I'm glad I'm not gay and Christian. Thank you.